folks, we are very happy to be here. I'm John Halamka. We got MiHIN Tripathi. We're going to divide up this presentation. I'll give you a basic overview of what the Argonaut project is, what it intends to achieve, where we are. Mickey's going to tell you truly from a boots on the ground perspective what's been delivered, how it's being tested, where you're going to see its impact on health information exchange in this country, give you some sense of real timelines. I'll also talk about some of the security and privacy aspects of it. We really want today's session to be useful, so we're going to offer a lot of Q&A time. And as I was mentioning to George, the person who connected us, we think that you might want to ask us about beyond Argonaut, things like health information exchange technology and policy and any lessons learned we have, whether it's patient identifiers, provider directory standards, or whatever. We are happy to answer any questions you have. So let me give you a bit of background. He's making... I see he's using some hand signals here. I hope everything's still okay. Okay, so what happened with the Argonaut project formation goes something like this. A super secret group of scientists called the Jasons gathered together in La Jolla, California, and was asked to evaluate interoperability across healthcare. They've got a testimony from Facebook, Google, Amazon, CIOs, people in and outside the healthcare industry, and their conclusion was a series of reports. They wrote a 2013 report, which was very general, 2014 report, a little bit more specific. And it concluded that healthcare doesn't get it. Healthcare is writing multi-thousand page implementation guides that require PhDs in informatics to understand, whereas Google, Amazon, and others have created APIs and SDKs that 16-year-olds over a weekend can write a cool app. It doesn't require this deep knowledge of the domain. So how in healthcare can we fix that? So we recognized, although the Jason report wasn't entirely accurate and wasn't entirely actionable, that it was inspirational. A number of folks gathered together at a restaurant in Washington, D.C. after hearing the Jason presentation and said, if we were to follow this idea of interoperability based on application program interfaces, simple standards, SDKs, and the sorts of things that social networks do, how can we bring that to healthcare? We then said, if we were going to build a guiding coalition of change agents, why don't we call ourselves the Argonauts? After all, we are following the Jasons, and we are going to slay the various beasts in front of us that are barriers to interoperability, find the golden fleece, etc. If we're going to be a guiding coalition, that's great, but we need an SDO. We need to follow ANSI rules. We need ballots. We need the right organizations to support generalized implementation of security layers and transport. And so let us get a series of companies together, and also academics and government, and we'll provide some funding and some oversight, but then we'll also engage HL7 and experts in the world of security to create a set of deliverables that will all be open source, publicly available, and that the guiding coalition would agree to implement and provide in their programs the APIs that are going to enable a different kind of interoperability than we've had in the past. Again, Mickey and I are very happy to talk about interoperability in general, but we would say interoperability in the past is focused on pushing payloads of stuff from place to place or pulling data about a patient from various locations. Whereas this notion of APIs is a bit more deep. It's not just payloads. It's how do I read and write structured data in and out of an EHR or a repository or a module like an app so that we can create an ecosystem of interoperability beyond just pushing CCDAs or pulling CCDAs. Those are the origins. Those are some of the goals. Our feeling was, although the SDOs are fine, the challenge with SDOs is sometimes they lack focus. We wanted a very sharply focused implementation based on just two profiles. The idea that you could send and receive structured data elements from what we'll call the core data set that's part of meaningful use in the interoperability roadmap of the federal government. Things like problems and meds and allergies and labs and diet care plans and care team. and that we would want a profile for document exchange of the unstructured stuff that we often find in the medical record, an HPI, an op note, a progress note, a discharge summary, that sort of stuff. So if that's all you did, the core data set and documents, you'd actually hit probably about 90% of what folks really need when they're writing cool apps or creating a module that layers on top of an EHR. So it doesn't aim to solve every problem for population health and care management and quality measurement, but it certainly opens up data liquidity in ways that have not been done in EHRs in the past. Again, to emphasize, open standards, open to all, no fees, no information blocking, no economic barriers. The initial folks who joined include those on this list. You look at it, it's really some of the biggest participants in the EHR ecosystem. So we got Cerner and Epic and Meditech and McKesson and Athena. And we also had folks like SureScripts or Advisory Board who provide services for interoperability. And we have academics like the SMART program at Children's Hospital. So really a broad array of participants. What was key about the organization is that it's this steering committee plus HL7 is the prime, and HL7 then lets subsidiary contracts for FHIR development, this fast healthcare interoperability resources standard, for security standards, and for overall project management to move the project forward very rapidly. And here's again, restatement of scope, those profiles for documents, structured and unstructured data, as well as a security implementation guide for simple transport and a security trust fabric based on OAuth. So you may have implemented Direct, and Direct works kind of okay, but there's some very odd history in the Direct project that the VA demanded that we use super strong, expensive certificates, and then the VA, after making that demand, decided not to use Direct itself. It was very quizzical. So Direct suffers a little bit from a security trust fabric that's hard and expensive. Direct Trust helps, but it's still harder than it needs to be, as opposed to OAuth, which is ubiquitously used by Netflix and HBO and every social media company without a lot of complex certificates or expense. So we thought that would be an appropriate model to follow. So let me turn it over to Mickey to talk about the timelines, the deliverables, and what we've actually got done.
Great. Thanks, John. So in terms of the time, we're a little bit in between here because this slide deck is sort of 2 weeks old, and actually some significant things have happened in the last 2 weeks. One is that our deliverables are done, so we're completely on track, and I'll describe that in a second. We are also just finalizing a phase 2 scope for the Argonaut project, which the steering committee has approved. So I'll describe that as well as we go through this. We just haven't had a chance to update the slides. So the high-level deliverables, don't expect you to go through all of the, every line item in this project plan, are, really two. One is a FHIR profile, a FHIR implementation guide that draws on the specifications, the narrow set of specifications that the Argonaut project identified as being the highest priority that are now a part of what's being balloted by HL7. So specifically focusing on a data level API and a document level API that I can describe in a second. And then the second thing is the security implementation guide based on OAuth. And John will describe that. Both of those are now the security profile is now done. It's available on the Smart on FHIR website. And for all of this, I don't think I have it in the deck, but you can go to argonautproject.org. That's Argonaut one word.org, and you'll find all of the materials there as well as the current deliverables. So the OAuth specification is done and available. The FHIR implementation guide is just waiting for final HL7 balloting of the specification, at which point we can finish the phase 1 implementation guide, and I'll describe that as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, there's a multi-level, kind of process here. We've got the steering committee that John described, which is the founding organizations. There are a couple of different teams, one focused on FHIR, one focused on security. And then importantly, we have project management, but most important is the implementation program that I'll describe after John goes through the security work. Next slide, please. One of the things that we think is very important is to make sure that things don't get adopted before their time. And John just described some of the, the industry challenges that we've all had with direct. And, one of the core, sort of subtext of the Argonaut project is to say, let's not relive that experience again, if we can help it at all. Recognizing that a move toward APIs and OAuth is something that is an industry and technology transformation outside of healthcare. It's just the next step in terms of the technology progression of internet-style interoperability. And to the extent that that is going to become a part of healthcare interoperability, what we wanted to do from the Argonaut project side is say, let's get market experience, let's get market input into that before it becomes a part of federal certification, rather than having it become a part of federal certification when it's frankly not ready for prime time. And though, it's somewhat ironic, I think that from an Argonaut project perspective, we believe strongly in moving toward these types of interoperability protocols. On the other hand, we actually believe that they are not ready for federal certification yet. That they're not ready, not mature enough yet, with not enough market experimentation among healthcare providers and with healthcare use cases to be a part of federal certification. So the approach that we have recommended is actually a part of the draft rules right now, which is to say that the federal government and ONC are signaling that APIs like FHIR will become a part of federal certification eventually, and they provide some opportunity for people as a part of meaningful use stage 3 to use those and get credit for them, but they don't require them. And they just sort of foreshadow and signal to the market that at a future date there may be certification of FHIR-based APIs, but we're not ready to do that yet from a certification perspective, which we think is completely appropriate and is exactly what we had recommended back in the late part of 2014 when we launched the Argonaut project. Next slide, please. So let me describe the FHIR work. What we wanted to be able to do is make sure, first off, that the foundation work that HL7 is doing with respect to DSTU2, which is the next sort of threshold for the development of the overall FHIR standard, that is supported, because everything that's the foundation that is required for anything that's going to be based on FHIR-based APIs. So the Argonaut project provides some general support to HL7 to make sure that that happens. But to John's point, one of the challenges with standards development organizations is being standard development organizations, they're not always as nimble or sensitive to particular and urgent market needs. They have a global audience, and they tend to follow, the rate limiting step in the approval of a standard tends to be whatever that last most obscure use case is that needs to be resolved, which may be, 1% of 1% of 1% of what happens, in the healthcare market at any particular time. So the Argonaut project says, let's take that foundation, but pluck out a certain set of resources and profiles, so using the FHIR vernacular, and focus on accelerating those and getting those out to market faster than they might otherwise, while HL7 follows its normal processes for making sure that the overall standard is coherent and that all of the use cases that ultimately need to be resolved are resolved. Next slide, please. So what we've done, so what does that mean in some detail? There's a notion of resources in FHIR, which is essentially like a clinical domain or a data type of domain. You can see there are 99 resources defined in FHIR, and those are listed there. The typical process for HL7 or any ASDO, but for HL7 in this case, is that you need to get resolution of all of these resources and the underlying profiles and resolved by the global community and have all of that approved before it moves forward. What we've said from an Argonaut perspective, as John said, is we're focusing on the common meaningful use data set, which is now under the proposed stage 3 rule will be called the common clinical data set. They love using the CCD route for everything, but we'll be updating that to that. But right now we're focused on the common meaningful use data set, and as you can see there, I've highlighted those in the light blue color. That's what the Argonaut project is focused on. So just to give you a sense, in some ways, the Argonaut project is not about expanding things. It's actually about constraining things and saying, let's focus on high value things and make sure that those are coherent and have high integrity and have enough market feedback into them and get them out to market faster than they would otherwise. Next slide, please. So we've also got an underlying set of profiles which specify essentially what a resource would be covering. So what are the lab value sets, for example, that would be a part of the the lab resource? That would be one example. We've been working side by side with the DAF framework, which is part of the S&I framework, in an attempt really to say that what the Argonaut project is doing is leveraging activities that are already out there and not trying to replace or displace them. So from the security side, we're building on the Smart on FHIR work that Josh Mandel and Ken Mandel from Boston Children's Hospital and the SMART program have done terrific work on. And on the FHIR side, we're saying let's take the great work that the data access framework people have been doing on the S&I framework and specifying value sets at a granular level, and let's have the Argonaut implementation guide focus on those and draw on those rather than trying to do something that would substitute for those or compete with those, because that creates more confusion in the market. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to John now to talk about the security work.
So I hope everybody in the room understands the orchestration of how a FHIR transaction works. Just to level set, let's just actually use a silly example. Harvard has 17 hospitals that mostly don't like each other, but let's say that Harvard is a trusted entity. Yale, however, is a totally different entity, and it is in Connecticut. It is not part of our organized healthcare arrangement. In fact, we have really no legal relationship with Yale whatsoever. However, Harvard and Yale decide they trust each other. I am a Harvard doctor. Down at Yale, they're running Epic. A patient from Connecticut comes to see me. I want to go knock on the front door of Yale and say, I would like their common data set, that clinical data set Mickey described, for that patient delivered to me now. So I have to issue a query, and the FHIR API will then issue back a response. The format of that response is in JavaScript object notation, so it's a set of fields, the data elements that you just saw from Mickey, which then I could either view as a human or incorporate into my EHR. So instead of the payload model that we used to have, which is I go send out a query and I get back a gigantic XML document, most of which is not useful and it's very hard to interpret, I am doing a direct API call into Epic and getting structured data elements in JavaScript format as discrete data elements that I can immediately incorporate into my EHR, reconciling the medication list, the problem list, the allergy list, labs, etc. So it is a much more tightly coupled approach to build this trust fabric, this capacity for Harvard and Yale to trust each other, for Yale to accept a query, or for Yale to send a response. We chose OAuth. And so transitive trust concept in OAuth is that Harvard says, I am a trusted doctor who is authorized to make a query, and that Yale says it trusts Harvard's certificate, and therefore I, as a doctor, log in using my Harvard credentials and can make a query to Yale. That's OAuth, and it requires this notion of certain certificates at an organizational level and members of those organizations validating who they are. Dixie Baker and Josh Mandel took the implementation guide that had been written for Smart on FHIR and built a very robust set of orchestration diagrams and very detailed implementation specifications to leverage this basic standard, which is used all over the internet, and to do it in the context of a FHIR application program interface query retrieve. It uses REST. Now, REST, of course, is the internet. It's HTTPS. It's the way that our friends at Google, Amazon, and Facebook communicate data from modules to the core applications hosted by those organizations. Initially, the scope of the OAuth was more along the line of how do 17 Harvard hospitals internally communicate with each other. But Mickey described this phase 2, which is coming very rapidly, which is cross-organizational trust using OAuth. It doesn't specifically cover the details of how an organization chooses to identity manage its individuals. Beth Israel Deaconess happens to use Active Directory. I authenticate with Active Directory. Beth Israel Deaconess, part of Harvard, now knows who I am, and then can use beyond that this OAuth to go across to other hospitals or across to organizations. So it's very simple. It's just leveraging existent web standards and an implementation guide that's tightly constrained and optimized for supporting FHIR. So Mickey, I can just describe this. The security layer could be used in a couple of different architectures. It could be used as the cross-enterprise Harvard-Yale example, but it could even be used with a mobile application to decide that a provider of mobile applications is a trusted participant and therefore can get and put information from an EHR. Here's a key example of this, is that Beth Israel Deaconess has been an early development partner with Apple on use of Apple Watch and HealthKit. And we have created this OAuth layer using the FHIR profile so that your bathroom scale data goes to your phone, or your Fitbit data or your watch data goes to your phone, and then your phone does an OAuth transaction in and out of our EHR. And in 1 second, the data that you, the patient, authorize to go to the EHR is delivered to us. We actually have this live in production. I weighed myself this morning, and my data from my scale went to my phone, into HealthKit, and then did an OAuth transaction and a Restful API call back to Beth Israel Deaconess and inserted my weight into our electronic health record. It's very simple. It took us a matter of days to implement. So with all of these standards requires implementation, requires testing, requires real incorporation into products. So Mickey, if you could talk about how people actually participate.
Next slide, please. So the implementation plan, so I should just say one last thing on that schematic that you saw that John was just describing. It said current scope, future scope. That's all now current scope, actually. So the left-hand side is actually past scope and done, and the right-hand side is current scope, because that's going to be the phase 2. So just so everyone understands, now we are now moving to the cross-enterprise use case, which is is fundamental, obviously, for interoperability nationwide. Advance a couple slides, please. Thanks. And for any of you, if you ever need a slide jockey, I would highly recommend Dr. John Halamka. He's fantastic at it.
Oh, thanks.
On the implementation plan, one of the key aims is get market feedback, get market experience into the code while it's still unstable, meaning that it's still being developed, right? You want to be able to do that as quickly as possible. So that's really a fundamental part of the Argonaut project, and indeed is going to be more and more of the focus as we go into phase 2 here. So the Argonaut project has open participation. We welcome and encourage any organization that is ready to start testing and would like to participate in the testing community to join. Next slide, please. So we've thought about this as, having different tiers or different implementation levels to suit the needs and the desires and the readiness, frankly, of organizations across the spectrum. So at the bottom is sort of, what we call asynchronous testing, which is a little bit self-service. So there are materials there that we have a reference implementation that's hosted by Grieve that has the Argonaut implementation on there. It has OAuth security that's now being put on over the next couple of weeks. It has de-identified data that can be made available for people who would like to be able to test a client against the server that we have hosted there and be able to test their ability to extract that data. And so it's there for people who want to do sort of self-service kind of hub and spoke sort of testing against a reference implementation. What we're going to be doing as a part of the phase 2 is structuring the testing program much more so that the top of the pyramid actually becomes more of the activity, is what we'd like to see. So we're going to be doing that in 2 ways. One is we're going to be structuring sprints that are focused on certain resources. So we're designing the schedule right now so that people who want to participate in testing could be a part of 2 to 3 week sprints, let's say, that are themselves little testing communities. They're, kind of like little mini virtual connectathons, as it were. But we want to be able to do that to march our way through the 16 or 20 Argonaut focused resources to be able to get people to test along the same lines and to provide some structure to it so that we can start to get as much live feedback as possible. And interestingly, our concern at the outset when we sort of developed this multi-tier approach is we thought, boy, we can't have anything too structured because everyone has too many priorities. So it's going to be really hard. What if we hold a sprint and no one shows up? And one of the, sort of the key pieces of feedback we got at the end of phase 1 was, you need to structure the testing program because then we'll make it a priority in our organization. So they asked us to provide them the structure, and then they will, sort of come to the testing sprints. So, so we've decided to do that now. The second thing that we're going to do is help to facilitate more many-on-many testing. So the part of the phase 1 was really focused on hub and spoke so that everyone is testing against the reference implementation. But again, through the desire of people who are a part of the phase 1, they've said, other organizations, and my organization is an example, we have a data warehouse where, we're happy to have some de-identified data and stand up our own server and have people come and test against that server. So we'll be doing more and more of the facilitation of many-on-many kinds of testing so that participants can test against each other, whether they want to test a client or a server or both. Next slide, please. Why don't we go to the next slide? So, as I said, participation is open to all. This is a little bit dated in terms of how to participate. You can certainly contact me directly or Jennifer Monahan, whose contact information is there, or you can go directly to the argonautproject.org website and click on the implementation page, and on the implementation page you will see there's a participation kit, there's instructions on how to enroll in the project, there's a Google Doc where you can just sign up, you can list which use cases you have. If you have an endpoint for a server that you want to expose to others, you can list that there. And then there's also a sign up for the Google group that we have for the Argonaut project so that you can participate in the testing community. So, and we welcome anyone. We would love to have anyone who's involved. There's no fee to participate. We're really trying to encourage as many people as possible. Next slide. I think there's a list on the next slide of those who are participating. This list is actually very, very dated. There are now over 50 organizations who have signed up to be a part of the testing program, including the ONC, including many of the major vendors who are not a part of the sponsor group. For whatever reason, they weren't a part of the sponsor group, but they are now a part of the testing program. And as you can see, large government organizations, and increasingly, and one of the things we're very excited about, is more and more small app providers. Both with provider-facing apps as well as consumer-facing apps, which is one of the things that we want to strongly encourage because we think that's an important part of the ecosystem now, and is also, frankly, one of the forcing functions that's going to get the entire industry to move. They're not hampered with issues of legacy code and other kinds of things, and are clearly a high source of demand to push people in the industry to have greater interoperability. And I think that's it, John. Yep, there's a link to the website and our contact information.
Well, let me just reflect for a moment at a higher level as we think of health information exchange and state activities, since we are speaking to folks in Michigan. By the way, all my family lived in Port Huron for many years, so I've been to Michigan several times. Great morels in May, by the way. What does a health information exchange do with this set of APIs once they're available? Well, imagine that the state government or your state HIE, however it's organized, decides to keep a list in a provider directory of endpoints. So therefore, if you want to pull data from a given hospital or doctor's office, you know what that endpoint address might be. In this case, it might be a RESTful URL, a place by which you can make a query. Well, you might also imagine that a patient has certain consent preferences. I recognize every state has totally different privacy laws. Massachusetts happens to be opt-in. Every state is up to them what they want to do. But our patients already, because we have already implemented this at many of our institutions, when they register for care, they say, I, the patient, would like my information from this organization available to other caregivers in the community who may need it. At which point, the fact that they have opted in for disclosure at that institution is published up to the state level relationship locator service. So now imagine this. Again, a patient visits a doctor somewhere in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The EHR goes to the relationship locator service, sees that the patient has consented to disclose data from 3 other EHRs, a specialist's office, maybe a mental health provider, maybe a hospital, totally, again, up to the patient where to disclose data. Then, because the provider directory has a list of RESTful addresses to query from, in real time, that clinician is able to then go issue the query and get a response and get the structured data from every place the patient has previously visited and consented to disclose. So this simply requires RESTful APIs, that OAuth layer we've talked about, and the idea that the state offers a provider directory and a patient-centric relationship locator service. Massachusetts has already built all of this componentry. It's been demonstrated in multiple public demonstrations, and of course now as our vendors make these RESTful APIs available in their EHRs, we'll have more and more information flowing. So that's our vision. We, again, totally a Massachusetts thing, chose not to create a giant central repository of every data element from every EHR in one place. We think a federated approach with directories, pointers, and APIs is more secure, more affordable, and more scalable. So with that, let me turn it back to you, and happy to answer any questions you have.
Aaron, I happen to be in Michigan attending this awesome conference that MiHIN is producing. Aaron Seib. The Precision Medicine Initiative is meeting at Harvard. I was curious if you guys would be able to try and educate them about the approaches that you're proponents of for Argonaut. They'll be at Harvard, I think, in mid-July. And they seem to be really anchoring to very old technologies. I hope you can educate them on some of the stuff that you're doing here.
We've got a lot of echo on the line. Oh, can you hear me now? We've got.
If we talk like this, can we hear?
That's perfect.
Okay, we can hear pretty well. Yep. Okay.
Great.
Is that better?
So go ahead and ask the question again.
Precision Medicine Initiative. They're having a meeting at Harvard, mid-July, I think. They're kind of anchored on older technology.
Sure. So I'm involved in the whole Precision Medicine Initiative and its planning and that sort of thing. So I have certainly carried this message. There are a lot of different architectures out there. The PCORI-net architecture is one of a central repository, and you are correct that that approach, while great for its time, is probably not appropriate in a world of APIs. So we are taking this Argonaut message to every nook and cranny of this country. If there is a place that we haven't reached, yes, please let us know, because we have such a large guiding coalition at this point. There should no longer be this older legacy client-server central repository thinking as we go forward with precision medicine. It's a chance for a new look with a new initiative. But Mickey, have you any comments on precision medicine?
Not in general, but I would just say, just building on what you just said, John, on the one hand, we want to be able to sort of spread that message so that people, as they are planning, are realizing that that they have to be adaptable to the technology changes that are going to happen, across the industry, and those are right in front of us, we think. On the other hand, we certainly want to make sure that everyone understands that, that FHIR, Argonaut, OAuth are not magic bullets. There are lots of things that are about workflow or about process innovation rather than technology innovation. So some of these things take time, which is why we're very focused in Argonaut on implementation. And I think nothing speaks better than just having successes, keeping our nose to the ground, getting EHR systems to put these into production systems, getting provider organizations like John's and Mayo and Intermountain Health who are participating to put this into their production systems, and that will start to speak volumes rather than us just trying to deliver the message without having anything behind it.
And as he said, there's no magic bullet here. I mean, we use different architectures and approaches depending upon the problem to be solved. So FHIR is a wonderful way of getting real-time data about patients. Well, it's synchronous or asynchronous for patient care coordination. What if you want to ask questions like, how many patients with this kind of breast cancer, with this kind of genome over the last 10 years in America have had a good outcome? Well, FHIR at the moment isn't really optimized for that. There are still going to be a need for certain kinds of registries, or if not a registry, using an approach like I2B2, which is a distributed query approach where I can send a question to the data as opposed to the data to a repository. So I think what's clear is that, as our federal and state policymakers come up with use cases, we'll use FHIR wherever we can, but it won't solve every use case. Okay, no problem. So everybody, pick up your iPhone. Android's okay too. Look in the lower left corner. You will see an app which has a heart on it. Everyone has one, unless you've deleted it. That app is a data repository of all the healthcare information in your home. The steps you took, the scale you used, the blood pressure you took. That's great. It's sitting on your phone. How would your doctor get a hold of that with your permission? Well, you could push it into the EHR of your doctor. You need an approach to do that. FHIR is a mechanism of taking structured data elements and putting them into an EHR or querying them from an EHR. Oh, but wait, you also need a security layer on top of that, making sure you are the rightful owner of the data and you are able to interact with that EHR. So this idea of OAuth is the capacity to figure out who you are and if you're trusted. So that's very simple. Imagine a mechanism for an app, a module, and a distant EHR to communicate with another EHR with structured data transfer and a security layer on top of it. That's the whole thing.
And let me just to have different approaches here. So imagine that you are shopping for something on Amazon and you click on a shirt size or a color. You'll notice that your browser window, the URL line, all of a sudden has all sorts of gobbledygook. It expands and explodes with all sorts of gobbledygook. And then what comes back is the different colors that are available in different sizes and by different brands. Right? You have just initiated a Restful API query and retrieve from the Amazon database. Right? You have asked it a specific question. You haven't asked it, give me a CCDA on everything that you know about pants. You have said, no, I want this particular pant in this size and I just want to know that color. So, and I don't want to build a complicated interface. I don't want to get a complicated document back. I just want to get some data back. So a RESTful API would do it through that browser window, through that URL, rather than having a complicated interface, does it securely, and it brings back only the data that you asked for, rather than bringing back the full set of data, which is the world that we live in now in healthcare. So that's one important difference, or I've just named two important differences. One is the RESTful approach, which is to say, let's use browser technology in the way that we've seen it used in all other places and all other walks of life, and you're doing it every single day when you're shopping, when you're doing any kinds of these exchanges with modern internet sites. That is a RESTful approach rather than having to build. Imagine if you had to build a complex interface to every one of those places to do what you want to do. The second is just being able to get back the data that you want at a data level, rather than the current world where exchange does happen, and we recognize that it's certainly not ubiquitous, it's not homogeneous across the country, but where it does happen, it's a CCDA. So I say, I want an allergy, what I get back is a CCDA. I say, no, I want meds. I get back the same CCDA. I want hair color. I get back the same CCDA. I have to take the whole thing and parse the whole thing regardless of the fact that I just want a small amount of data. And you can imagine that for an app provider, let's say, someone has got a dog hair app that they are offering on the App Store or on Google Play. And what they would like to do is be able to, with your permission as a patient, go and get any of the information from Beth Israel Deaconess that Beth Israel Deaconess has on me that's related to dog hair allergies. They don't want to know anything else. But right now, the model would be that if they went and they were able actually to get it, they would get a CCDA back. They wouldn't get just the information on allergies, for example. So that's an example of a FHIR API in a RESTful approach and how that's different than what we live with today. The OAuth example, as John sort of said very quickly before, is being able to have delegation of authorization. So, and again, every one of you, I guarantee, has done this within the last 2 weeks. If you go on, you try to use HBO Go on your computer, the first thing it'll ask you is, what cable service do you have? You click on Verizon FiOS, let's say, and immediately a box pops up and it has Verizon FiOS window and says, type in your Verizon FiOS credentials. You type those in. Verizon FiOS in the background passes a token to HBO Go and says, that's John Halamka. It's okay. Let him in. And every time you get onto a website and it says, oh, would you like to create a username password on this website? Or would you like to use your Facebook credentials? Which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but people do it. And that is another example of OAuth, that site is saying, I will trust Facebook's Facebook's representation that the person who just logged into Facebook is who he or she claims to be. And imagine how that could scale in healthcare as well. I hope that helps.
Also, but let me contrast CCDA and FHIR for a minute in a way that hopefully folks will understand. Anyone who's tried to read a CCDA document knows that you have to understand the HL7 reference information model and have a PhD in informatics to be able to parse the thing. What if all you wanted, as Mickey said, was to find out somebody's allergy list? Well, does a 16-year-old app developer in their garage know how the SNOMED CT hierarchy, allows us to record reactions to substances which are coded in RX norm? Like, they would have not a clue. But what FHIR would say is, we are going to define this resource called allergy. It's going to have a substance. It's going to have the reaction to the substance, the severity of the reaction, who observed it, and a date timestamp. And every time you query for an allergy, it's going to come back with 5 data elements, those 5. So all the app developer has to say is, Mickey, do you give me permission to query your allergies? Yes. Okay, I'm delegated now to query. I now query your medical record. I get 5 pieces of structured data back. Is one of those dog hair? No. Okay. Well, that's all. It's very simple. No PhD in informatics required. That's the FHIR idea. Well, I think, again, it depends on the use case. FHIR is not a payload, right? FHIR is a real-time transaction using an API. If, for example, I want Mickey to do some analytics on my behalf and I want to send him a bunch of payloads, I would still use CCDA for that purpose. So I think what everyone in the standards committee and the vendors are saying is, yes, it's true that we will replace complex XML static structures with FHIR wherever possible. But we will still need a static representation of data, and the CCDA will map to FHIR, so in effect it can be the payload version of a FHIR query where needed.
Yep. And the other thing I would add to that is that, and perhaps in more lay terms, documents are really important in healthcare. It's not like other places where with Amazon, you don't want to get a document back. Well, why would you want a document? Why would you want a full payload? You just want data back from Amazon. Then it represents it in its own website in the way that it's going to, in the way that it thinks is best for you. But in clinical care, data is important. But documents are important. Sometimes the clinician wants to be able to see the full context of the sending clinician and the static data that they use to make that context, that they use to make the interpretations that they did. And so that's why we think that documents are important, and they will always be important. Now, whether they're going to be CCDAs or some other kind of payload, some other kind of structure as we go forward, I think in healthcare we always need to recognize that data at an atomic level is important and serves some use cases, but the documents are also important because they bring the entire clinical context, which is often important in a particular episode of care or particular point of care setting.
And so to this point, there is this idea of what if a plaintiff attorney required us to prove medical decision-making based on an episode of care? the FHIR API is fabulous for meds and allergies and structured data in the record, but does it tell a story? It doesn't. And so, well, the CCDA, as Mickey just said, might be, well, here was the nature of the visit, here are the observations, structured and unstructured, here was the medical decision making, and here's why I did what I did, signed date stamp, and now wrapped in a security layer so that it guarantees integrity. And therefore, as we went from, say, my record to another record, sending that whole document across would have some legal non-reputability about it. So we'll use both. So it's sort of an interesting question, and based on your work with Graham, I would say, Mickey, he's defining resources, and there might be a resource that has all 12 data elements in it, or it might be 12 different calls. I mean, a resource is an artificial construct, right? We can define it to contain whatever data you want. What we just simply said is, for the moment, we are going to, in the interest of simplicity, break up the data into these atomic chunks called the problem list, the medication list, the allergy list, the labs, the diet, the care plan, the care team. But who knows, right? He could define, I don't know, a resource called PCP Specialist Referral that has all those things in one package. I think we'll see what the use cases are and define resources as required.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And that's a part of what happens, through implementation is it's completely, and there's, it's completely open in terms of, how we could construct queries and whether it's one at a time or any permutation or combination you could think of. But through conventions that get developed from people using them, you'll start to see how those get constrained and things that are sensible and that make sense. So if you look at the stage 3 NPRM certification rule, which I would not recommend, John and I know all 461 pages by heart, and it's a painful experience. But you'll see in there actually that they do start to get their arms around this kind of concept. They say in there that if you're going to have an API that's focused on the meaningful use common data set, for example, they say that the API should be able to get any one of the data elements or be able to say, I want all of them. And in that case, they say if you want all of them, it should present a CCDA. With Argonaut, we are, as a part of phase 2, going to be looking at what we call practical constraints to be able to help define what might be the 3 or 4 types of queries we might want to enable as a part of an Argonaut implementation guide to say, here's how you would do multiple data elements from within the meaningful use common data set. Here's how you could do all, and here's how you could do a CCDA.
That because we've done this work with Atrius, it's a policy decision. So Atrius internally has decided that if the data is older than 5 years, they do not believe that delivering it is going to be clinically sound because they don't believe that is, from a HIPAA perspective, an active patient and it's not going to be that useful. But Beth Israel Deaconess has not erased a byte of data since 1991. So when you query us, we deliver everything from 1991 to the present. Nothing to do with FHIR, purely a policy decision. And I mean, I don't know, Mickey, maybe you do, if Carl and Judy have decided that they are going to bake into their FHIR interface either a policy setting that is user addressable, or they are just going to declare, like Atrius did, it's 5 years to the present.
Yeah, no, I don't think that any organization has yet made that decision. And I know certainly, I deal with Epic a lot, and they've always had this a little bit of the view that they want to see if they can drive consistency in people's experience. So defining it with certain constraints, as you said, to current patients and these CCDA elements has been a part of the way they have thought about it. But it could be that they rethink that as they think about how to do a FHIR-based API, for example. And every vendor is going to go through that consideration of how much configurability do they want to allow. And then you're going to have the provider policy decisions about, given the configurability offered by their vendor, what policy decisions that they want to make to perhaps further constrain it or not.
See, we've had a trouble at Beth Israel Deaconess of not really being able to be paternalistic. We don't know what data you will find useful. Maybe 20 years ago, the fact that you had chickenpox is actually relevant today to your immune status. So 5 years, well, maybe that's good, maybe that's not. Yeah, sure, a chest x-ray from 1930 is probably not so helpful about today's cough, But maybe it could be, because it could actually show a deformity you've had your whole life. I mean, I don't know. So we'll share everything. It will not be policy based. It'll be parameter based. Sure. So maybe, Mickey, you could take the first one and talk about how we define phase 2 and how Argonaut is not an organization exactly. It's more of just a guiding coalition that probably will serve in the definition of use cases with multiple stakeholders. And I can take the HSPC thing.
Okay. Sure. So, in terms of that question, I mean, we as we said in the slides, but we went by really quickly. The Argonaut project is really just as the name describes. It's a project. I like to think of it as a code and documentation sprint. And obviously it's the building of trust among a set of organizations to try to rapidly accelerate FHIR-based and OAuth-based approaches, and rapidly develop some business conventions around them and some clinical conventions around them so that they can be used more readily and more quickly. The phase 2, so we focused on those 16 resources that we described earlier. We will certainly add, once we have a little bit more visibility into what's going to be in the final rule, the expansion to the CCDS, the Common Clinical Data Set. And if you see the Stage 3 rule, there are certain things that they add to the Common Meaningful Use Data Set or the Meaningful Use Common Data Set, and they call it the CCDS. So we'll certainly add those. And the thing that we are also going to add as a part of the phase 2 is a provider directory implementation guide, a FHIR-based provider directory, because that's obviously very important as we think about the direct-based world today and the challenges that people have been facing with provider directory interoperability. So that will be the only thing that Argonaut is focused on from a content perspective outside of the Common Clinical Data Set. And then we're going to be spending a lot of time on the implementation input into that. And then, as I described to the question about what kinds of queries will you be able to do, what we're calling practical constraints. So one would be on the query side. For each one of those resources, you may think that, well, in most cases, here are the kinds of queries that would be the most common types of queries. And let's try to constrain some of the queries to those, because you can imagine from a vendor perspective, you could bring down a production system if you don't have some kind of brakes or throttle mechanism to prevent someone from coming in and starting to hammer away at data level through a data level API for information. Now, obviously, on the server end, you would have some built-in throttles, but wouldn't it be nice if we could have some conventions around here are the 4 or 5 types of queries that are supported to support 90% of the use cases that are out there. The other thing that we're doing is practical constraints on the value sets. So rather than having a profile that has all 30,000 LOINC codes that are a part of the Quest lab compendium, how about the 400 most common labs that are used as a practical constraint on it? And then for those who want other ones, they can go to other resources. So it'll be very, very tactical, very business based. As John said, we are just a project. We're not an organization, not a standing organization. We have phase 2 in front of us. We're going to accomplish that. And then if there is need for further phases, and the Argonaut project seems like a good vehicle for accomplishing those, we'll take those as they come.
And the scope of Argonaut is really agile sprints. That is, what can we do in 6 months? So when we defined the Argonaut project and its initial set of deliverables, those were done between December and April. Done. Now we're defining another sprint, which is going to be done over the next couple of months. So the HSPC work, very valuable work, but that's more of a 5-year duration, not a 5-month duration. So I think we'll absolutely take all of Stan Huff's and the HSPC's work and incorporate it into future FHIR profiles when it is ready. But I would say they are complementary rather than competitive, purely based on scope and time frame. So my view on this is, having done standards for 20 years, optionality is bad. I mean, it's basically like saying your USB drive, well, it could use a Thunderbolt interface or it could use this big interface. So wait a minute, I now have a PC with 20 connectors? I don't know, how's that going to work? So what we have to say is, yes, the resource concept in FHIR is fungible. I mean, as use cases arise, we can create different resources. But then when we agree that we are going to exchange data, we have to be very constrained. You know, there's one PCP specialist resource that we're all going to use. Otherwise, it will be chaos.
No, I was just going to say that sort of reiterating the point that that Argonaut is about constraining things in practical ways. So to say that we'll define perhaps a set of queries or a set of constraints on the way that someone could query in a particular domain would just be a part of the Argonaut implementation. People can choose to use it or not use it, but it's based on market experience and market implementation feedback from people who are saying, if we could just do it, constrain it to these 3 or 4 ways that serves, the combinations that most people are going to want, then we'll have served a valuable purpose. And, people can use other implementation guides if they like, but this at least has some important market feedback from some very experienced and large players.
Appreciate your time.
And of course, you can send Mickey and I any of the morels that you guys have found. Not false morels, those will kill us, but live morels, that we're good. So we'll have a wonderful day.
Be careful there.
Yeah, have a wonderful day in Michigan, and certainly we're happy to help you with any future challenges you may encounter.